Well, good morning if you are somewhere in the world where it's morning and you love Maria Callas. Good afternoon if you are somewhere in the world and you love Maria Callas. Good evening, and a special greetings to people in New York, in Paris, in Milan, in Athens, in any place where Callas spent a lot of her time. But really, greetings to people around the world as we celebrate a star and artist. This is the fifth of my five programs that I've done on Fred Plotkin on Fridays about Maria Callas. And welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. My guest today is someone I'm very happy to welcome. I've never met him. We don't know each other, but I'm an admirer of his work. And I think that he will have a lot to say and a lot to contribute to our Maria Callas ring cycle, if you want to call it that. His name is Tom Volf, Volf. And Tom, do you join us from Paris?
Yes, I am joining
Okay.
you from Paris.
Are you French?
I'm French, yes, although I've lived many years abroad, but yes, I'm now based in Paris.
Okay, because I don't know you at all. Please tell us about you.
Where to start? I've had a very, shall we say, unusual career, starting from very early on as a musician and a pop singer to a photographer, a filmmaker. I've worked for various institutions and worked quite a bit in the fashion until I encountered Maria Callas back in 2013, 10 years ago, and that was the beginning of a whole new journey, starting with my first feature-length film, Maria by Callas, that took 5 years in making, and that
And that
was
actually will
soloed.
be central to our conversation today.
All right.
But you speak excellent English. Where did you acquire your English?
I lived in London and in New York for several years. Actually, when I encountered, I'm using the word quote unquote encountered because that's how it felt like with Maria
Mhm.
Callas. I was living in New York back then.
Okay. So um, let's go right into it. But I'd like to talk about your really wonderful film, which is why I was so eager to have you join me, because I saw your film many times when it came out, I believe in 2018. Am I correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Um, and it was controversial, but then so was Maria Callas. And
Was it?
oh
Was it
yes,
so?
yeah, it was. Um, it was controversial because I think it's simple to say everything about her was controversial because people have their strong opinions. It's interesting about Maria, let's call her Maria, that people who never heard her, and most people alive today never did. I did when I was 8 years old. Um, most people have very strong opinions about her, which is fascinating. It says something about her to me that people feel they have to have an opinion. People may have strong feelings one way or the other about contemporary opera singers, but it's as if you have to be partisan. You have to, in one way or another, declare either your love or your disregard for Maria, and you prefer, quote, Renata Tebaldi. Back on December 2nd of this year, the actual anniversary, I know that in Europe, there were many documentaries on European television. I know this because I was in two of them. So just the fact that I'm in competing documentaries already says something about the fact that no one no one seems to own Maria, which I think she probably would have liked. What do you think of that sentence? Nobody could have owned Maria.
Surely, no one does own her. She barely owned herself, as the starting point of of my film, Maria by Callas, was her saying that there are two people, Maria and Callas. And I think she had a hard time owning that, owning what she had become, which is something she wanted, because she had ambition, at least in the beginning of her career, but at the same time, something that had become a weight. And the new film that I have just released in cinemas, which is the revival of her 1958 historical performance in Paris, for the first time entirely in color, restored from the original reels and with a fully remastered original sound. We start the film with her arrival in Paris the day before the legendary performance of December 19th, 1958. And when she arrives, she says a few words to the journalists. Of course, it's a huge event, and she's surrounded by fans and press. And the first thing she says, the journalists ask her if she feels anxious about the performance on the following day. And she says yes, because the name is heavy to bear. And I think that says a lot, especially her saying that in 1958. So, yeah, no one really owns her. And to roll back on your question, I also think that it is quite wonderful that she's celebrated throughout the world on the occasion of her 100th anniversary, and that she is still a source of inspiration for so many people, film directors, documentary directors, photographers, fashion designers, contemporary artists, you name it. She's a constant source of inspiration. It's fascinating that so many decades later, she still is, perhaps even more than ever, because she has become somewhat of an icon over time, and that seems to take a different shape even further in the 21st century than it already did in the 20th century.
So this leads to a question that I'm going to frame a little differently than I would have planned to, but here it goes. I, for many, 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 many years, have been working on a biography of Michelangelo Buonarroti. And I always say that it took him 45 years to complete a particular sculpture, so I have time. But it has been a fascinating life journey to basically live with him through my lifetime and explore him in great depth. And in reading every biography, every source material that I could about Michelangelo for many years now, I've discovered that it's not so much that it's the same Michelangelo, but it's the era in which he's being written about. So when he was written about in the 19th century, and it was the time of the Risorgimento, of the formation of the Italian nation, he was depicted as an Italian hero. When it was the time of fascism and the glorification of the Italian male heroism, whatever, was about that kind of physical splendor that he created in some of his male portraits. In the 1980s, when there was what's called queer theory and ideas about homosexuality, about same-sex love, whatever term we use that comes under the umbrella queer, suddenly Michelangelo was a queer hero. And if you read about him, the famous book, The Agony and the Ecstasy, there was no sense of his having any sexuality at all, but being rather religious. When you read religious texts about Michelangelo, he's a devout Catholic. So I'm concerned, but I wonder your opinion about whether the Maria that each person presents and studies is as much about the presenter, the writer, and the scholar as it is about Maria, and that she becomes a convenient vehicle for everyone else's agenda.
It's a very good point, and I think it's very true for most of the things that have been done about her and that are still done about her, whether artistically, whether feature films or books, many books, even, I mean, from biographies or so-called biographies to novels. And there's been quite a few recently that came out. Pure fiction, inspired by her, where you don't really differentiate the truth from the untruth, from the imaginary. And in those cases, surely it does say a lot about the authors or the directors or the people who project often their own vision of her. And that's fine. There is space for everything. However, I took a different path from the very beginning, because I could have done the same thing, obviously, as a director, whether the films I've done or the books I've written as an author, or rather published, because I haven't specifically written. And that is also something I haven't done in my films. I haven't specifically created something of my own projection. What I have chosen to do from very early on, from the start 10 years ago, was to do something, well, first of all, that would be in her own words entirely. And that's already a very different standpoint, because I have put myself in her service. I have put myself behind herself, just as a messenger, someone who would use whatever skills I have acquired to present something that would be 100% authentic. And that was my interest, because in the end, I often said that I ended up making the film that I would have wanted to watch. When I started discovering her only 10 years ago, I didn't know about her before. So I was 28 when this started. And I was curious, first, right after the first emotion that I think everyone experiences when they hear her voice for the first time. Immediately after, there is this curiosity that is natural. You want to know more about her. And I've read so many books and I've watched so many previous documentaries and programs and stuff. And yet I felt still kind of frustrated that I didn't really connect and I didn't really understand who she truly was, both as a woman and as an artist. And of course, I ended up understanding that the two are intimately connected and intrinsically influence each other. And she said it herself once again. So I ended up making the film that I wanted to see, which is a way for her to speak about herself. And as she said, I'm the only one who can speak about my life, because after all, I'm the one who's lived it. And that's so true. And also there has been so many mistruths said about her during her lifetime and afterwards, that there wasn't really, until then, until I've started this work, anyone who actually removed themselves as whoever they are, directors, authors, curators, to put themselves in the service of her, of someone greater than themselves, which is actually very much what she has done. She has always said that she was a servant of music, that she was a servant of the genius of the composers that she interpreted. She never thought much about herself. She never thought about her genius. She would have never even dared to think about her genius. She often said that she had a very poor image of herself and that she was most of the time dissatisfied with her interpretations, and she was often in pain that she couldn't serve those composers and those geniuses in the way she would have wanted. So I have also chosen the same path of putting myself in the service of someone greater. And therefore, I was extremely careful to never project something of my own visions and understanding, merely to try and project through my work what I gathered from her own words, testimonials, written words, letters, or the direct testimonials of the people who were closest to her, who I was very lucky and privileged to encounter and to spend time with. And through those direct testimonials, I've tried to establish and create projects that would present herself in a completely authentic way, both as a woman and as an artist. So this was a peculiar and unique endeavor, I would say, in compare to all the others that would do what you just said.
Name some of those people who you had the privilege of speaking to, who you included in the film, or perhaps were not included, but who informed your approach.
Well, no one was included in the film per se, because as much as I had the idea in the very beginning that the film would be a mix of archives and testimonials, and I have actually shot over 50 hours or even 60 hours of interviews and conversations with the 30 plus people I have met all around the world who had known her. Some of them were the people who were closest to her. Some of them were people who were there next to her at certain episodes, certain times of her life. But very soon, I think a year or two in the process of making the film, Maria by Callas, I have decided that I would end up not using all the shots that I had made of those interviews and conversations to privilege a film that would be entirely made of her own words and therefore entirely made out of archives. And that was the very challenging process that I undertook in the following 3-4 years, to find all the archives and documents and images and sounds to put together what I call a puzzle, which has been this film to me, gathering all the various pieces and putting them in a way that makes sense, that tells a story, a life story. And that is what has become Maria by Callas. But those testimonials have nourished my work, of course, deeply. They are also what gave birth to the institution that was set up in 2017, which is the Maria Callas Foundation, which we established in Paris, and which was a desire of the people who were closest to her, who have decided to entrust this mission to me, which is something that I carry through until now, and perhaps even more now than ever, because we have gathered the biggest collection in the world of her personal archives and documents and memorabilia. And part of our mission is to preserve and protect all those archives and documents within the foundation in Paris, and ultimately to establish a Callas Museum in Paris, which would not only preserve those documents, but also make them available to the public, to researchers, to biographers, to future opera singers. So all those people have played a very big role in all of my work. And to name a few, there's been as much those who were, shall we say, in the spotlight. So people like Zeffirelli, of course, Franco Zeffirelli, Georges Prêtre, Alain Delon, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, those people who all had known her one way or another, either by working with her or having spent time privately with her, were some of the people I have met and that have helped me through this work. But more importantly than those were, of course, Ferruccio and Bruna, because namely her...
Explain who they were.
Well, Ferruccio and Bruna were her, shall we say, butler, driver, and Bruna her, shall we say, maid. But it is very limiting to use those labels, because you have to think of those two people as the two people that she considered as her only family. She had completely broken up with her actual family. Over the years, she had no contact anymore with any of them. And Ferruccio and Bruna have lived 25 years with her under the same roof. They were the two only people present the day she died. And those two people, contrary to many others who had known her, have decided to remove themselves from society when Callas passed away, and have never participated, not even in a single interview over 4 decades. They have preserved her privacy, her secrecy, and an utmost faithfulness to her and to her memory. And when I started this work, and one after the other, the people I have met eventually led me to them, and that they have accepted to not only help me, but take part in my work, support me, and trust me with incredible material and documents that they had preserved and that they had never shared with anyone, but also be next to me throughout the process. For instance, while I was editing the film for 6 months, I was on the phone with either of them almost every day. I was asking them for guidance to be sure that whatever episode of her life I was putting together in the film was completely authentic and true, because that was, if I had one obsession, it was that. It was to be true, to be honest. And they have helped me throughout. Bruna actually died on the very last month of the film editing. So
Uh-huh.
unfortunately, she has not seen the film finished, but she witnessed every single step over those years until almost the very last step, the finishing line of editing the film. And Ferruccio, who is still with us today, has seen it through and has seen the film finished. And the most gratifying thing for me, perhaps, additionally to all the numerous thousands and hundreds of thousands of people around the world who have seen the film, is the fact that the film was valued and recognized by the people who were close to her, and in particular Ferruccio, as something that was true to her and that would pay homage to her and that was honest and that would represent her exactly and truly as she was. So all those people played an important role in all of my work.
I really, in my practice, tend not to go into private lives of people. And I just sort of feel that it's called private life for a reason. So I leave that. But I will say that this is not about Callas's private life. It's about Ferruccio and Bruna that I'm interested in. How did Callas encounter them? Where in Italy are they from? What was their background that brought them to Maria Callas and made them the right people to be with Maria? I ask this in part because, having worked in opera for decades, I've known many people who occupy the role of Bruno and Maria, Bruno and
Bruna and
Bruna
Ferruccio.
and Ferruccio, excuse me. And they're very particular people. They're very good people, but they're very special people in that they, in effect, have given their lives to the artist.
That's very
And
true.
it's a
Very
very
true.
particular character. And as I said, I'm not naming names, but for many of the greatest stars in the world who I've worked with, I've also known their Bruna and their Ferruccio.
Mm.
And those people are remarkable people too. So I don't know what you know about where in Italy they're from and when Callas first found them.
I know all about it, of course, because I've spent countless hours discussing with
Yeah.
them, and I've always met one to one. So that created a very unique bond and friendship for us.
I would love to know
Well,
just the very basics of where they're from and when Callas first met them. And
they were both from the countryside in Italy. They come from very simple backgrounds, and they were of a family that worked in various ways of service.
Mhm.
So she first met them. She first met Bruna, and Ferruccio arrived a year later in the mid-50s while she was living in Milano. And she had a previous maid that was with her when she lived in Verona. And when she moved to Milano, she started looking for someone. So Bruna was the first one who was hired, and soon after Ferruccio. And none of them came from anywhere close to the world of opera. They were not familiar with it. I think they barely really understand what her world was about. Of course, she was already quite famous at the time. So the funny story is that Ferruccio, when he was first offered to come and meet her in order to get the job, he refused because she had such a reputation in Italy that he was afraid that
Mhm.
she would be someone tempestuous and whatever the Italian press has depicted her. as. And eventually, I think that the bond between them was created over time. And especially in 1959, where they had only been in her service for a bit over a couple years, or maybe 3 or 4 years, um, when she left her husband and started her love story with Onassis, and soon after moved to Paris, the fact that they both followed her and stayed with her throughout, and throughout 10 years later, the breakup with Onassis, and the following year, I think a very particular family-like bond
Mm-hmm.
was created between them, because it was much more than in the early days where they were, in service, working. It was not a job anymore. It was like taking care of a family member. As a matter of fact, in some of her later attempts at writing a memoir, Callas spoke of Bruna as someone who would be her sister, her mother, her friend, and all of that at the same time. And I think she really regarded her as such. And also, it's interesting when she did the last tour, which was called the Comeback Tour, and which is now called the Farewell Tour, because it ended up being the last time she was on stage. So for 2 years, she toured around the world, and whenever either of them could travel with her, it was not always the case that they both could, but she would always make sure that they have in every hotel the exact same room as she had. There
Mm-hmm.
was no way she would have let them be treated as beneath her. And they would have meals with her. When she would go out for a dinner with friends, they would be with her. So she regarded them as really her family. So they were really important. That is why Maria by Callas is dedicated to them.
Did Bruna do the cooking?
Bruna did the cooking, yes, and Ferruccio,
So,
many
Tom,
other.
I don't know what you know about me, but a lot of my background and work, apart from opera, is I've written many Italian food books, and I know Italy quite well. And if you know, I don't have to know the town, but the region that Bruna and Ferruccio were from, is it Lombardy? Is it Veneto? Is it Friuli? Is it Emilia Romagna? It would tell me more what Callas ate.
Ferruccio was from the region around Piacenza, and Bruna was from the region Veneto.
Veneto. Okay, so that makes sense. Um, because I've often wondered what Maria Callas, who famously was heavy and then glamorously thin, and obviously watched her weight, her diet, and so on, what Callas ate. And
Well,
Bruno,
there has been a book published with the recipes, because one of her hobbies was to collect recipes.
yeah,
That was back in the days she was in Italy.
mm-hmm.
But you have to remember that she chose to establish herself in Paris. And from the 60s onwards, she adopted a very Parisian lifestyle, including mainly French food. And they would most probably cook pasta once in a while. But there is a photo shooting, for instance, at her apartment, Avenue Georges Mandel, where Ferruccio is serving lunch to her. And the dishes you can see are very French, are very Parisian. So I think that after her divorce, she also removed herself a little bit from the Italian culture, although she would, of course, speak Italian with Ferruccio and Bruna.
How is her French?
It was rather good. It
Yeah,
was rather good. She gave a number of interviews in French. In the book of her letters and memoirs, which I have published, there are a few letters written in French, although most of the letters are written in English and in Italian. But I would say that French was her third language after Italian, English, and perhaps Greek, which she didn't speak that much, and she didn't write it much either. So, but it was the language of her parents, so perhaps French would be the fourth language.
mm-hmm. um, I would like now to ask you how you, I think you used the word encountered, how you first encountered Maria Callas.
It was
In,
one night of
yeah.
2013, January 2013, after serendipitously walking inside the Met Opera for a random performance that was really on the spot, and it happened to be Joyce Di Donato's Maria Stuarda,
Mm-hmm.
with the staging back by McVicker, and fell completely in love with bel canto on the spot. And when I came back to the little room I was living in in an apartment with roommates in New York, I looked immediately on internet, anything I could find about bel canto and Donizetti, and the first thing that came up was a recording of Callas's Mad Scene from Lucia. And that was the very first moment I heard her and was moved by her, and subsequently started listening to anything I could put my hands and ears on, and then had the curiosity to want to know more about who she was. And so that led on a journey of several months just discovering her world, her recordings, um, mm, her live recordings, her pirate recordings, reading books about her life, and the turning point was meeting in New York someone who had actually known her, which really was a game changer, because to have a first-hand testimony replaced immediately all the possible biographies I had read, and was depicting someone rather different than the person in the books. And that is really what made me want to make the film in the first place, because, as I said, it is the film that I would have wanted to watch. It is a story that I was so eager to hear. And I found that in any documentary, previous documentaries that had been done about her, the most fascinating moments were when there were actually interviews of her and when she spoke. And everyone else's opinion was secondary. So, yeah.
Um, you said that you were immediately taken by this video of Maria singing the Mad Scene. As specifically as possible, what gripped you about it?
I think it's the unexplainable emotion, the thrill that one feels almost physically in your body. I think anyone who listens to Maria Callas cannot be indifferent. You were saying earlier that she was controversial, that everyone has to have an opinion, but it is because she doesn't allow to be indifferent. And her voice and her interpretation doesn't allow to be indifferent. You can love or hate her, most probably love her, but it creates something that is not cold, that is vivid, that is alive. And, for me, it was emotion, it was goosebumps, it was tears in my eyes, it was everything that is unexplainable, because I was listening to something that I had no idea what it was. I had no idea about Donizetti. I had no idea about Lucia di Lammermoor, not the story, not the character. And yet, this whole Mad Scene was completely live and real to me when I was listening to her. And that was an audio experience alone. Of course, when you're lucky enough to see Callas, and through the few film recordings that we have, and the Paris 1958 is one of them, of course, the thrill is even multiplied, because you see something that matches so much what you hear, that it amplifies it.
What you just said reminded me of a quotation that I wrote down to read to you, almost word for word. There was an American opera singer who died much too young, whose name was Patricia Brooks, who was a very fine soprano. She had a motor neuron disease, I forget which one, and she died way too young. But no one is the next Callas. I don't even use that word. But she was a very fine actress and singer. And Patricia Brooks said about 50 years ago, you did not necessarily like Callas's performances, but you were not indifferent to them. So that same word of being indifferent, Um, I think that's part of what grips people today about her, is that your conception of whatever an opera singer can be. I was interviewed not too long ago for a documentary about the American jazz singer Billie Holiday. And as an opera person, they approached me to talk about Billie Holiday as a singer. And I said, I think what we respond to in Billie Holiday is the same thing we respond to in Maria Callas, that we detect pain. And whether Maria or Billie were communicating pain is a different thing. It might be something about their less than perfect voices, but very expressive voices and remarkable musicianship and singing and breathing and everything that they knew how to do. But I think that people who are looking for pain when they hear Callas singing La Mama Morta from Andrea Chenier or Norma, any number of roles, they feel pain or they identify or they say, oh, that's so much emotion and it's very real to me. And this gets back to the thing I mentioned before about people having their Maria. And part of why your film captured my attention so much is it really was her Maria. It was not your Maria. And it's
Thank you
one of
for
the
that.
rare examples that I've come across in years of learning about Callas, as we all have, that it really was Callas in her words. Now, the title of the film is Maria by Callas. To you, Tom, is she Maria or is she Callas?
She's both. And I have chosen to name the film Maria by Callas specifically because of that unearthed interview with David Frost in 1970, which is the only time really where she states it in her own words. There are two people in me. There is Maria and there is the Callas that I have to live up to. So that gave me a very profound understanding of the duality within her. And therefore, the film had to be this sort of parallel journey of Maria and Callas because they go hand in hand. But I have also decided to call the film Maria by Callas and not Callas by Maria because the film is, I think, revealing the woman to her, the woman behind the legend. But it is through Callas and through her interviews and public interventions and performances that we understand Maria. So Callas reveals Maria to her more than the other way around. And that is why I think what I found very gratifying is when people wrote to me or told me after seeing the film in cinemas that they felt they have encountered her, they have met her, like they've spent 2 hours with her. Because I think the approach that I tried to have with this film was to create a very intimate moment between her and the audience for everyone to experience their Maria, as you said, and their relationship to her, whatever that relationship is, and to understand her as a human being, because this is something that she really thrived and fought all throughout, was to be understood, and to be understood most of all as a human being with exceptional talents, but also with exceptional work and work ethics that established this artist, this Callas, that was sometimes heavy to bear and sometimes difficult to live up to. But it all starts with that human being. And oftentimes she suffered because she was not understood as a human being. And that she said people expected something unhuman of her, like to sing perfectly all the time. That is quite
Mhm.
unhuman. Although what moves us in her singing is her humanity and her vulnerability and probably her human imperfection. So, because humans are imperfect, and that's what makes her and her character so moving, because they don't make perfect choices. Um, and through that, through those imperfections, we reflect ourselves. And this is why it is something that is universal. Both those beautiful characters created by the composers as the interpretation of a great artist like Callas, um, because that brings a universality that is something we all can connect to, and that is quite unique.
Either in the film itself or in the materials that I've read about the film, you correct me if I've said the wrong thing. Callas refers to herself or is referred to as a demanding perfectionist. And I identify with that. I know a lot of people do for whom perfectionism, yes,
Me too.
I could feel that with you, for whom it's not a burden, it's a virtue. And I don't see that as a negative thing as long as one accepts that you can be a demanding perfectionist, but acknowledge that you very seldom achieve perfection, if ever. But what you're doing is setting the standard very high. And
Exactly.
I think that her value, the way I connect to Maria, is the sense of that you have to do your very best job. You have to work
Yeah.
with great seriousness and not cut any corners whatsoever. And if you're not your best, well, here's an issue. If you're not your best, you bring your best on the day, or do you just not appear?
It's very true. It's
Yeah.
very true. I can relate entirely. And I said, hey, me too, because when you follow her footsteps, she establishes those standards for you. And if you're actually honest in what you're doing, when you have someone who establishes standards that high in whatever she does, that when you carry out a work dedicated to that person, how can you make it any standard under? That would be a complete betrayal. And perhaps that is why it took me 5 years in making the film, because as a bloody perfectionist that I have become, I needed to make sure that this film, because it would be the ultimate film, on Callas or in her own words and blah, all that. I felt the standards were so high that it was mandatory for me to do something that would at least um, be acceptable as as something that she would have endorsed. And that is why I could not get any relief and any rest until, to be honest, the moment that Ferruccio came out of the cinema and called me and said she would have really liked it. And, she would, once he endorsed it, it was like she was endorsing it. And I didn't really take much rest because I carried on with books and exhibitions and stage performances and so on and so forth. And now with a second film. But I could at least feel um, a tiny bit of satisfaction, although when we're a perfectionist, as you may know, we're never really satisfied. That is the doomed perfectionist that is also in her own words that you can never get satisfaction because you always feel that you can do more and that you should do more, and it's never good enough. And I've never really felt that my work was good enough, especially for someone that I adored and revered so much. But at least to have the feeling that I have done something truthfully and that from the people who were closest to her, to hear that she would have liked it and that she would have appreciated it and she would have endorsed it, then that at least helped me to feel that I was on the right path.
Perfectionism in the wrong hands can be paralyzing
Right.
and can prevent people from working, or on the other hand, it really creates issues. I said to you before that I've walked with Michelangelo for many decades. He was a perfectionist and would destroy works of art of his own that he felt were not up to standard. We have a few that were incomplete, and we look at them as examples of where he tried in his journey. I hate the word, but I'm going to use it on a particular sculpture, for example, or painting or drawing, we understand that he had a dead end. And he didn't destroy some of these pieces of sculpture, others he did. But we look at them now as examples of his creative process. Today is December 15th. Tomorrow, December 16th, would have been Beethoven's birthday.
Mm-hmm.
And Beethoven, I see Beethoven and Michelangelo as the same kind of personality, that he too redid his works and destroyed many things and tore them up and burned sketches, and Michelangelo burned sketches. And I wonder if Callas would have, if she could have burned certain recordings and burned certain pirate recordings, especially, that captured her in ways that she would not have approved of.
She did, as a matter of fact.
Oh, did she? Okay.
Yeah.
How was she able to do that?
Well, for instance, we know for sure that the second act of Sonnambula at La Scala was taped and recorded on video, on film, and that she saw it, and there was something she didn't like about it, as a perfectionist as she was, although I'm sure that we would treasure something like this if we had it today. And she had it destroyed. And a few other things. Surely she collected and treasured her live performances, because later on she would realize those were testimonials of something that she didn't realize when it was happening. There is this first-hand story that I was told by Robert Sutherland, her pianist, in the last tour, that one evening, Avenue Georges Mandel, they would play something. And when Callas said play something, it usually meant one of her live recordings, or so-called pirate recordings. So that night they would play the Lucia of 1955 with Karajan in Berlin. And they listened in silence. And at the end, she looks at Robert and she says, "So what do you think?" And Robert was so moved, he could barely speak. And he said, "Well, it was beautiful, Madame Callas. It was really beautiful." And she said, "Beautiful, beautiful. It was bloody miraculous." And to see that I was unhappy with this performance, and now I would give everything if I could sing like that again. So those pirate recordings, those live recordings, were really a treasure for her in later years. And I was told that she would never, or almost ever, listen to her studio recordings, because she felt that in the studio she missed the warmth of the public, the presence of the public, and also because she had to limit herself with the microphones. She couldn't really sing entirely free as she would on stage. And that is why she said that, in one of her letters, she says, "I hate recording," which is, something almost contrary to what we think, because she has left us with a wonderful recorded legacy. But
which I covered in detail last week with Alain Lanceron.
Right.
It's worth discovering, yeah.
Right. But she has left, that is now with the Callas Foundation in Paris, numerous reel-to-reel tapes with numerous of her live performances, some of which have never been published before, because she used to keep those sometimes as working copies, sometimes as, just an archive of one of her performances. So we have, for instance, her very last Lucia in Dallas in 1959, which has never been released, which is the only copy probably existing, which is the one that she kept in her apartment. Her entire Norma, her first Norma in Paris in 64, not in 65, which is also a fantastic document and testimonial. We have numerous rehearsals and working sessions, which poses the question, and that relates to something you've said just before: are those documents meant to be published and made available, and would the artist have approved of it? And I have often pondered upon this, because we have this material, we have those archives, and they are not, in my idea, only for preservation. I believe that those things have to be shared with the public, have to be made available. I do not believe in people retaining documents or archives to keep it for themselves as a treasure that they can just have a personal satisfaction or show and display to a happy few. I believe that for an artist who devoted and dedicated their life to the public, to their public, and especially Callas had a very deep connection and relationship with the public in general, those things have to belong to the public in the end. That is why everything I have done through the film, the 3 books, the exhibitions that I have curated and created, they were all to make whatever archives and documents I was entrusted, make them available. And that is the purpose of the future Callas Museum in Paris. So my answer would be that although in her lifetime and in the time of her prime, or even in the later years, while she was still alive, surely she was very meticulous and would approve only specific things to be released. And that is part of the duty of the artist during their lifetime. Now, we have a duty to the artist after they've passed away. I don't believe that we can do just whatever, but we have a duty to be respectful and to honor their legacy. And I believe that ultimately, for the Callas Foundation to publish those recordings, including the working sessions, including her rehearsals in 1976 or 77, which are very interesting and fascinating documents, audio documents, that are part of her artistic legacy, that can enlighten us on her artistry, that can enlighten us on her musicianship, and how a great artist and great musician, because undoubtedly she was, and that until her very last breath, even with her voice being in decline, but how such a great musician kept on working, and how those testimonials contribute to enlightening us about their process. In the same way that her masterclasses, which are recorded, and we have the complete archive of the original tapes from all of her masterclasses, how those things can enlighten us about the working process of such a great artist. Because this is a mystery that is very difficult to solve, and that we can only try to grasp through recordings, through interviews or letters. But I think this is also a trove for future generations and for musicians and singers in the present and in the future who would want to follow on the footsteps of such great artists as herself. So that is my point of view.
I'm going to get more to that in a moment, but I have to say that an image you created for me a few minutes ago, I have to follow up with. I imagine you know the film Sunset Boulevard by Billy Wilder, starring Gloria Swanson as Norma Desmond, William Holden, and Max Eric von Stroheim playing Max, the Ferruccio character, so to speak, of Norma Desmond sitting watching her films in her mansion on Sunset Boulevard and remarking about how great she was and how interesting it was. And there was a sadness in that scene, in the whole film, but there's a sadness in that scene. And in my mind, I sort of went to Callas listening to her own performances in her home with her closest circle with her. I may be completely mistaken. I may be just investing the image of Sunset Boulevard into Maria Callas, and then maybe it's unfair. But it must have been sad for her to later in life hear what she did do and could have done. And as you said, I wish I could sing that way now.
I think there is a limit to the comparison. Certainly, there was something of looking at one's great past and with nostalgia towards the past, surely. But the difference, I would say, between Callas and Norma Desmond is that in the character of Norma Desmond, there is something extremely narcissistic and egocentric. And that is quite the opposite for Callas. I think that her misery was that she never realized how great she was, perhaps, because she was a pessimist and a perfectionist. And listening to those recordings in the 70s, so many years later, not only brought nostalgia, but also brought, because she was a fighter and she had a strong willpower most of the time, brought her in her a desire to try and come back. I think this was an obsession in the 70s for her, is how to come back. And I think she really hoped and believed that through very hard work, and that for sure she did, and all those working session tapes are testimonial of that. She was extremely hardworking into trying to get back that voice that had been in decline, like an athlete tries to get back his capacities of running the Olympics. So that is the main difference. And I think that to the very last day, and the greatest testimonial is a working session at home just a couple of weeks before she passed away, that testify how much she was still working in order to eventually come back and perform again or record again. There is a story that Ferruccio told me that the day she passed, she had actually a meeting with her agent who wanted her to record Traviata. And at first she said, he's mad. How could I ever record Traviata now? But at the same time, he said this is something she was considering, because she had never recorded Traviata after the very first Cetra recording. And of course, we have the wonderful testimonials of her Lisbon and London Traviatas. But this is interesting to think that, contrary to general thought, she was not really depressed and lonely and solitary and suicidal. Surely not suicidal, because someone who is suicidal does not keep working and rehearsing and make appointments, who is their agent. So I think it's very moving that
I'm just going to
at
push
that
back a
stage in her
little
life.
on that with you. Sorry, Tom. I don't understand suicide. It's a tragic and a very complex psychological structure. I have known of people who've committed suicide who worked up to the end, who made appointments, and then when they didn't appear for their appointments, that's how people understood that they had committed suicide. It's hard to know. I'm not saying Callas was suicidal. I don't have any. I never had that feeling either, but I do know that it's such a particular pathology of emotions that it's hard for us as non-medical experts who didn't know the people personally to ever really understand. Part of suicide, from what I can glean of it, is that we really don't get it. There are people who make frequent attempts, but then there are other people who mysteriously just do it when they seem full of life and joy.
You're absolutely right. But I was trying to make a point that, contrary to what is stated in some biographies, Callas didn't commit suicide. And the fact and proof of that is that she was not alone the day she passed away. She was with two other people under the same roof, with Ferruccio and Bruna. And I was told minute by minute what happened that day. And that is by all means a heart attack that came out very suddenly. And that was in no way, there cannot be any doubt that it was a heart attack. Nothing more than that. Nothing else than that.
I think opera singers in general, and Maria in particular, have a burden that if they've recorded a role and acted it so persuasively, if you are Norma and singing Casta Diva, you are forever imprinted with being Casta Diva. If you sing La Gioconda and you sing the aria Suicidio, you suddenly are identified with the ability to commit suicide. An artist, Adio del Passato from La Traviata, an artist of Maria's caliber and artistry, but also who did all these roles, could easily, by stupid people, be equated with the roles themselves, and not that she was Maria and that she was Callas, as you elegantly frame it. It's a
Yeah, it's
wonderful, yeah.
going back at what we were saying earlier about writers who project their own thoughts and imagination on someone else. I think that I would say that the role of a proper, honest writer, journalist, or director, as a matter of fact, of a documentary director, is to rely on truth and to rely on facts. And there are so many stories about Callas that oftentimes when I'm interviewed for my work, some journalists sometimes bewilder me with a story. You know, recently I was giving an interview for an important newspaper in France to talk about the new film that was released in cinemas. And he said, "Oh, is it true that her parents had seen an astrologer and the astrologer had said this and that?" And I said, "It's a lovely story. And the person who imagined it had a lot of imagination. But you, as a journalist, what are the facts that you are basing on to relate such a story?" And if you want to know about Callas's childhood, I can refer you to the book of her letters and memoirs, because in her unfinished memoirs, she actually covers all her family story and history and talks throughout about her parents, her childhood. And that is a great factual source, firsthand. But why do you need to go and fetch some stories that you're not sure whether it's true or not true, when you have simple facts and you just need to, as Callas was saying, it's all in the music. They just need to look at the score, speaking of the young singers. And in the same way as singers have to just follow the score and what has been written and thought by the composer, I think that when you're writing or creating something about Callas, why don't you just look at her writings, listen to her interviews, and it's all in there, and there is plenty enough to make a biography and to tell a story which will be truthful.
Um, you anticipated my next question, but before I ask it, I want to make a little comment on what you said, that even the greatest artists and the greatest, most people with the best perspective and detachment can either elaborate or change their personal stories so that they may say that I had a wonderful relationship with my mother, or I had a terrible relationship with my mother. I would also want to ask the mother what she thought,
Yeah,
because we're
that's
only
why
getting one side. Yeah.
if you're an investigator, if you're a journalist or a documentary director or a writer, you check sources. And that's a way to check facts and check reality,
Mm-hmm.
surely. And through my work, I can tell you that in Callas's case, and that, of course, made my work a bit easier, doing something in her own words, she didn't really change the facts
Mm-hmm.
or establish a different story of telling her life story. So she was actually rather consistent throughout the years when she spoke about such or such episode. And the people who were the first-hand witnesses gave testimonials that corroborate, and that can then be established as a fact. But that is quite different from gossip and
Mm-hmm.
other sort of stories. And I think Callas, she said it, and it was true, that her most important values in life were honesty and integrity. She even said in an interview that there was a very high price to pay for those values, and surely she had to pay this price in life. But I think she was all about honesty. In her work, in her interpretations, in her recordings. She was honest throughout in the way she performed. There was never a lie, there was never a betrayal. And she was honest about her life story just as much.
The question I originally had that you anticipated is the following. Does the Maria Callas Foundation have her scores? In other words, the music that she read and studied from, and if they do, her markings. I've had the ability on some occasions to look at the markings of Toscanini, of Bernstein in conductor scores, and occasionally I look at singer scores. And they're very interesting because you learn about the artist through the markings that they make in the score. Do you have Maria's scores in the foundation?
We have her librettis. We do not have her scores because we have one, I think, which is not marked, and others have been all scattered in auctions. So one of the goals of the foundation is to eventually gather back the things that were scattered in auctions. And we are in touch with a lot of private collections, and we establish relationships with them in order for some of them to make donations to the foundation, or at some other point, the foundation has acquired some private collections. So ultimately, I hope that the foundation can gather her scores. I have seen a few of them, and they were rarely heavily marked. Most of the times, either just indicating cuts that the conductors had decided on, or that she had agreed on with the conductors. Sometimes in the early days, she would translate the Italian lyrics in the score. Some of her librettis are noted as well.
Did
But
she translate them into English or Greek?
English.
Okay.
It was her mother tongue,
I
English.
know that. I'm a New Yorker, but
Yeah,
a
you are.
lot of people, especially in Italy, whom I know,
Yeah.
somehow forget that inconvenient fact that she was an
Right.
American. Yeah.
Right. Which she always reminded in
Yeah.
any interview. And so I don't really think that her scores and librettis are the greatest source of understanding her musicianship and artistry. I believe that her master classes are a fantastic source for that. John Arduin's book is on the Juilliard masterclasses is a great source because it's a transcription
Mm-hmm.
of numerous masterclasses. We have a fantastic trove at the foundation, which is the recording of her masterclasses given in Japan in '73. There are a couple hours there that are very interesting because they are later on after Juilliard. And she would also say that it's all in the music. And it would take a musician to listen, to actually listen and pay attention, to learn everything about her musicianship through her recordings, and especially the live recordings,
Mm-hmm.
more than any other.
Yeah. About an hour ago in our conversation, you opened a tiny window that I'm going to completely bust open because you hinted at a question that I've had for you since I saw the film 5 years ago, the film Maria by Callas. You said that in January of 2013, you heard Maria Stuarda at the Metropolitan Opera starring the wonderful Joyce Di Donato. And I wondered why in the film, the person who did the reading and the recitation was Joyce Di Donato in your film. How did that happen? I love Joyce, so there's no issue of that she's great, but how did it happen that you got Joyce? Why did you choose her? How did she agree to do it? And how did you work with her to make that rather wonderful recitation that she did?
Mm. Well, I contacted Joyce very early on in the process, actually. I wrote her an email soon after the January performances, telling her that that night was a revelation for me and that it opened a whole new world. And that since I had discovered Callas and that I had started, was very early on in the process for me, but I had started working on a documentary film. And she replied soon after, and we met in New York. I have actually interviewed her for the film when I thought that the film will have interviews. Um, and we kept in touch. We saw each other again. I also attended several of her other performances. I think I attended almost every Maria Strada she sang anywhere. She later sang it in Covent Garden in Berlin, and I was there. And we remained in touch all throughout the process of making the film. And by the time I was editing the film and I understood that the letters would be a very important um, link between the different episodes that we could cover with visual, audio, and image material, that the letters would reveal something more intimate of Maria and also create links between episodes that we didn't have any other material than letter to talk about in her own words. So it was very natural that I thought, and I've asked Joyce if she would do it, because I thought that as an artist, as an opera singer, as a woman, she would, first of all, I knew she'd relate to Callas and that she had a particular feeling and link with her, and that she could read Callas's letters in a way that would not be either just a reading, a blunt reading, or something that would be played, because the point was not to do masterclass, by Terence McNally, which is something on its own as a theater play, and which had the great success that we all know. But here I wanted truth. I was constantly seeking for truth. And for me, the way we worked with Joyce in recording those letters, it was a very subtle way to use her voice and the emotion that Joyce felt with Maria's words. This is what we try to grasp and to create that link in between Callas's actual voice and her actual words without ever disrupting and blending in. And I think Joyce really put herself in the service of Maria with reading those letters in the film. So it was
I
a very
agree, but
natural process.
it was unexpected to me, but in a delightful way, because I know her. I knew the voice when I heard the reader. And I wondered, that sounds like Joyce Di Donato, and how nice, but how unexpected and how unusual, given that Joyce has a very typical mid-American accent in her reading. She does not affect accents. Maria could have a New York accent when she was captured off mic, so to speak, but she spoke in sort of pearly mid-Atlantic speech. By mid-Atlantic, we mean somewhere between London and New York, in her public pronouncements. But Joyce used neither. It was a very particular reader's voice that captured the elegance of Maria, but captured the intimacy of Maria. And I was thrilled with how she did that, but it was a nice surprise. Let's put it that way.
Good.
Yeah. On December 2nd, on the actual 100th anniversary of Maria's birth, there was a symposium in New York, sponsored by Teatro Nuovo, which is a company that focuses on bel canto, Callas Past and Future. The first speech was given by Will Crutchfield, who heads Teatro Nuovo, and he studies and teaches a lot about bel canto style. And it was a fascinating day throughout. And one of the things that Will Crutchfield said is the following about Maria: she matters today because she will be experienced by the future of opera. And I thought that was an interesting construction of that sentence. Not that she will be experienced by people nowadays who are getting into opera, like you when you first encountered her, but she will be experienced by the future of opera. In other words, people now who want to be opera singers, or people now who want to direct opera or be audience members, or who, like you, stumbled into it and were changed by it. They are the future of opera. And I'm interested in your response that a mid 20th century artist who died in 1977 would be still the paragon of opera today, nearly 50 years after her death.
This has often been on my mind because everything I have worked on, whether the film, the books, or everything, I had always in mind that this should not be only for opera lovers, but that should be something also for people like I was before. And I always remembered my 28-year-old self entering on tiptoes this world of opera that was very new to me and that I thought was not that easy to access. And Callas made it easy for me to access this world. She opened this whole world for me. Joyce did as well through her performance in Maria Stuarda, surely. And in that they have something in common. Perhaps the great artists in opera are great because they make opera universal, a universal language, easy to access for anyone. Doesn't take to be an expert or knowledgeable or even a connoisseur to feel emotion and to like it and to love it. And as a matter of fact, many people in the world listen to opera like, just very few operas perhaps, but surely they would have a Callas recording of Norma or Traviata.
Or Tosca.
Or Tosca. And this is what Callas has achieved and still achieves, because why she's still 45 years, over 45 years after her passing, so relevant and so present and so celebrated on her 100th anniversary. I think it's partly because she has taken opera and brought it out there and made it accessible to everyone, and that anyone can find something in Callas that they can relate to, and that can be an entry point into the world of opera. So, for instance, now when I released in cinemas the new film, Callas Paris 1958, they told me why this film is so special. Well, I said not only because it's a historical performance or legendary performance, but also because it's an entry point. Anyone who doesn't know anything about Callas, or actually doesn't know anything about opera, can watch this performance, especially, to watch it in great image and in color and great sound, all that. Then it's an entry point into the world of opera, because you have there Norma, Trovatore, Barbiere, Tosca. It's a fantastic entry point. It's almost a taste of something that then anyone can choose their own path. This morning I was invited by a school teacher to talk about Callas. They did a screening of Maria by Callas in the school, and there were 12, 13-year-olds there, about 100 of them gathered, and they were really, excited. They had never seen Maria Callas, never heard her. They had just watched a film with her, and they were mesmerized. I could see it. And what I told them is that this is a starting point. You can take it and just remember it as something you've enjoyed, and if you felt an emotion, then it's beautiful. And it can, for each of you, become the beginning of a journey. For me, the beginning of the journey led me on to making a film, books, another film, and exhibitions and stuff like that. And because I became so passionate about this, and because my journey, my job, and my path was directing, filmmaking, writing, so on and so forth. But each one creates their own path out of something. But the beauty of artists like Callas and why she's so unique and so special is because she speaks this universal language and she invites us into her world that we can enter very easily. And as she used to say it herself, it's a world of beauty. It's a world that makes you believe in something better in life, in something greater in life. And I think that her whole life she tried to achieve bringing beauty in people's lives, and that she still does through her artistic legacy. And we all, whoever contributes to it, you, me, others, we are messengers of beauty. And we all play a role in bringing a little bit more beauty in people's lives. And perhaps the world needs it now more than ever.
If I could put on my business card, Fred Plotkin, Messenger of Beauty, I would be very happy.
Very good.
Tom, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm
Thank
just going
you.
to ask you to add one thing. What is the website address for the foundation? Is it FR? Is it ORG,
It's
EDU?
callasfoundation.org or mariacallas.fr, both.
Okay. And do you know what you want? I guess the next project is the museum.
Absolutely. I think that now, after 10 years, I have achieved much more than what I would have dreamed of as an artist, as a director and a writer and a curator. And with the new film, the Paris 58, I really feel that it's a wrap for me in this journey, the artistic journey, that is. But I feel now that I have been entrusted by Callas's friends and loved ones to have and carry on this mission. And I take very close to my heart this mission that is the legacy. And I think that the foundation is the pivotal institution, is the only official institution which has this role of taking on Callas's legacy and bring it towards the future generations in the best possible ways, through whatever endeavors that are to come, the releases of recordings, the establishment of the museum in Paris. And while we celebrate her 100th anniversary, I also think that it would be good to think of the next 100 years and what we can all do in our respective roles to contribute to her legacy, and to keeping that art form alive that she has dedicated her life to.
So how do you say messenger of beauty in French?
Un messager de la beauté.
Ça va comme ça. Tom Volf, thank you so very much. This was
Thank you, Fred.
a really
Thank you for
wonderful
having me.
conversation. Sure, and a great way to conclude my 5 weeks of covering Maria Callas. I think it does point toward the future, and with people like you doing it, I feel a lot more confident that Maria and Callas, both of them, will have a secure future. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Fred, with all my heart.